All right, so one topic that is always of interest in the discussion of the interaction between psychology and the legal system is that of the NGRI, or the not guilty by reason of insanity, or the insanity defense. This is commonly misrepresented in mainstream media, so I wanted to give just a little bit of background on this and how it works as a nutshell. This is an illegal class. We're not going to dive into it too much, but just as a quick little recap of what happens here. So first of all, one thing to be aware of is this really is not even that common. Now, each state in the US has different guidelines for when and how it can be used, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. But it really is not very common. One estimate is that only about 1% of criminal proceedings is the NGRI ever even put on the table as an option. And within those 1%, only about 25% is ever successful. So what we're talking about here is a fraction of a percent of cases where this is actually even relevant. Another thing to set for context with this is one of the concerns with the NGRI is that people think, okay, so you can go and kill somebody and claim that you were crazy and then just get to like go home and go to therapy a couple of times a week and everyone goes on with their life. And that's actually not how it works. A lot of research has actually shown that individuals who successfully use an NGRI defense end up spending about twice as long in confinement as those who are just sentenced to prison. Because usually what happens is they are sentenced to some sort of inpatient or supervised mental health facility. And the length that they will stay there is not determined by their medical team, by their mental health team. The length that they're going to stay there is actually determined by the legal system, which is obviously a concern in the mental health field, right? Because then you have judges and lawyers making decisions about how long someone's mental health warrants treatment rather than leaving it up to the discretion of their doctors. But so one thing that we tend to see is that those who end up being confined to an inpatient mental health facility following an NGRI do actually end up spending longer in confinement than those who go to prison. So now I want to talk about specifically how does this work from state to state. And we're not going to review all 50 states, but we're going to review a couple of patterns that tend to exist. So right now, every state that does an NGRI, the evaluation of if the defendant is eligible to use this is based off of one of 4 different criteria. And some states combine these. So these 4 things that we're going to talk about are the building blocks of each one. The first is the McNaughton Rule. The idea behind the McNaughton Rule is that there's 2 key points to this. The first is that they have been diagnosed with, the official legal wording is, a disease of the mind. So they've been diagnosed with something that would indicate that there is some sort of psychiatric disorder, mental deficit, and something of that nature. And then the second part of it is that because as a direct result of that disease of the mind, they're unable to distinguish between right and wrong, or they didn't totally understand what it is that they did. So that's the McNaughton Rule. That one is actually the most common ones that states defer to. And actually in Missouri, a big part of our NGRI criteria is based off the McNaughton Rule. The second one is the Irresistible Impulse Test. And the Irresistible Impulse Test, again, there needs to be some sort of mental disorder, psychiatric disorder, intellectual deficit that's already been established, right? And because of that disorder, they're unable to control their impulses. So this is different from the McNaughton Rule in that it's not saying that they didn't know right from wrong or they didn't understand what they were doing. They're saying part of their disorder involves impulse control, and this person was at a point during their disorder where they had suppressed impulse control and they just were not able to control what they were doing. The third one is the Moral Penal Code Test. The Moral Penal Code Test. And that's whenever the individual, because of a mental health deficit, didn't understand that their acts were criminal. Okay. So again, very different than not knowing right from wrong. They didn't understand that they were criminal. They didn't understand that there was this huge of a legal implication of a law-breaking component to what they did. They didn't understand the criminal nature of the acts that they had committed. And the fourth one is the Durham Rule. And the Durham Rule, now this one is unique because they don't actually have to have a clear clinical diagnosis given. The other ones, they need to have a diagnosis. The Durham Rule is just there's some sort of mental deficit. We don't have to label it. We don't have to define it. They don't have to meet a specific set of diagnostic criteria. There just has to be enough there that we can say they have a mental defect. And that mental defect in some way led to this criminal act taking place. So as you can see, this one is definitely the most loosely worded. The others really require some more details to be nailed in. But that's just a basic overview of the NGRI, how it tends to work in the court system, and how infrequent it is to actually see these types of cases.